Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Angela Greiling-Keene. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News and the 106th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming with events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. To donate to programs offered to the public through our National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit press.org/institute. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you in our audience today. Our head table includes guests of our speaker, as well as working journalists who are club members. And if you hear applause in our audience, I'd note that members of the general public are also attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are featured on our member-produced podcasts, available on iTunes. You can follow the action on Twitter today using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a question and answer period. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you to stand briefly as your name is announced. From your right, Carl Lubsdorf, Dallas Morning News, Washington columnist. Maria Recio, Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Washington bureau chief with McClatchy Newspapers. David Calloway, USA Today, editor-in-chief. Adrian Garcia, Harris County Sheriff. Kevin Merida, Washington Post, managing editor. The Honorable Rodney Ellis, Texas State Senator. Skipping over the podium, Allison Fitzgerald, Project Manager for Financial and State News with the Center for Public Integrity and the Chair of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Skipping over the speaker for a moment, Bob Cardin with Cardin Communications and the Speakers Committee member who organized today's lunch. Thank you, Bob. Bobby Patton, a Fort Worth business leader and the owner of the LA Dodgers. Betsy Fisher Martin, the Senior Executive Producer and Manager of Political Programming for NBC News. Marilyn Thompson, Bureau Chief for Thomson Reuters. Jamila Bey, a host and reporter with Voice of Russia and a blogger for the Washington Post She the People blog. And Rick Dunham, a political reporter with the Houston Chronicle and a former National Press Club president. It seems now like the whole country was watching when our guest today literally stood up for her beliefs on the floor of the Texas State House. For 12 hours, she filibustered a Republican-sponsored abortion bill on her feet without being able to sit, lean on her desk, or drink water. That act temporarily blocked the abortion bill and made Texas State Senator Wendy Davis a hero to liberals and pro-choice activists. Senator Davis is no stranger at beating the odds. She began working after school when she was 14 to help support her single mother and 3 siblings. By 19, Senator Davis was a single mother herself, working 2 jobs to make ends meet in hopes of creating a better life for her young daughter. She eventually enrolled in community college, a journey that culminated with a law degree from Harvard. Soon after, Senator Davis became a practicing attorney in Fort Worth and served 9 years on the Fort Worth City Council. She was recruited to run for the Texas Senate and scored a huge political upset by defeating a well-entrenched incumbent. In the Senate, Senator Davis ran and won election to the She won election in 2008 in a race that was considered one of the biggest upsets in Texas politics in recent times. She was reelected in 2012, despite Governor Rick Perry and every major statewide Republican office holder personally campaigning against her. In the Senate, her main issues are economic development, education, and family issues. She was named Freshman Legislator of the Year in 2009 and was cited by Texas Monthly Magazine as one of the state's 10 best legislators. She apparently likes the filibuster because, prior to the one that got her national attention, in 2011, she staged a filibuster on public education that drew statewide attention to a multi-billion-dollar cut in Texas public schools. That filibuster temporarily blocked the cuts and set the stage for the legislature restoring most of the money in 2013. Senator Davis has been mentioned as a possible gubernatorial candidate in Texas. a steep climb for a Democrat in such a red state. We're hoping she might tip her cards here today on what her future might hold. Please help me give a warm National Press Club welcome to Senator Wendy Davis.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me here today, and thank you, Angela, for inviting me to be here. It really is a pleasure to be in such an esteemed group of people. Now, I have to tell you that people get a little bit nervous when I approach a podium these days. And I'm sure that you obviously know what happened on June 25th in the Texas legislature, but in case you were one of the few people who was not live streaming it, I thought I would just repeat the entire thing for you today. So y'all need to just get comfortable. In seriousness, I am very honored, and I'm so grateful that you're interested in hearing more from me. I'm constantly reminded what a privilege it is to have a voice in a decision that affects everyone's lives and their future. And though I mean voice figuratively, my initial understanding of the power of voice was actually quite literal. When I was a young girl, my family tried to spend as much time as we could with my grandparents. They lived in the panhandle of Texas in a small city called Muleshoe. My grandfather made his living his entire life as a tenant farmer. And when he was in his mid-60s, Neely Stovall suffered a massive stroke. From that point forward, he lived the rest of his life in a nursing home. He was partially paralyzed, and he had a very, very difficult time forming words because of his paralysis. When my mom and my siblings and I would pile into my mom's old hatchback Volkswagen and drive to Muleshoe to visit him, we would pick him up at the nursing home and keep him in his home for the weekend with us. At some point on several of those occasions, my grandfather would beckon me into the kitchen, and I would sit with him at their old Formica table, you know, the ones that have the silver band that goes around the side. And he would bring a piece of paper out, point very determinedly at it, and I knew my task. He would dictate to me a letter that he hoped to communicate to a friend. And as you can imagine, he's sitting there in his wheelchair, me with my tiny legs stuck to the plastic chairs in their kitchen on a hot summer day. It was a lot of hard work. It was slow, and it could be very, very difficult. And it was challenging, not just for him, but challenging for me as well. And invariably, on those occasions, my grandfather would start crying, which meant that I would start crying too. It's a very hard lesson for a 9-year-old to witness the despair in her grandfather's face. But the experience drove home a very powerful lesson for me: the importance of having a voice, how painful it is to lose it, and how important it is to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, and to be true to what they would say if they could. Many of you heard my name for the first time last month when, as Allison said, in the last hours of the Texas legislative session, the partisans in power attempted to pass not just an abortion bill, but a bill that would block health care access to tens of thousands of women across the state of Texas. In the process, these partisan lawmakers were seeking to rob Texas women of their voice. Because when women showed up at the Capitol to testify, and they showed up by the thousands, many of them were turned away, and they were unable to give voice to an issue that had a very real impact on their lives. Before I took the floor that morning for the longest 13 hours of my life, I worked with my staff to track down testimony that had been submitted in committee hearing but had not been read. And during the next hours, I read every single one of their stories out loud. These were real people with very, very personal stories to tell, many of whom had never, ever given voice to their story before, to another human being. At first, my staff was worried that I was reading them a little too fast, because 13 hours, as you can imagine, is a long time to fill. But amazingly, throughout the day, as word spread through the Capitol about what was happening, our email started filling up with stories that were coming in from women and men all over the state of Texas. In fact, by the time that day was over, we had received over 16,000 personal stories. 16,000 people who were hungering to be heard. I have to tell you, at some point in the day, I stopped worrying about running out of time or worrying about running out of stories, and instead, I started worrying about running out of time. When I stood up at my desk that day, though, I had no doubt that filibustering the bill was the right thing to do. But I had no idea that it would trigger such an overwhelmingly positive response around the country. Across the state and, of course, across the country, there was an outpouring of support for Texas women. And the most remarkable thing about it is that stories that otherwise never would have been told were suddenly national news. The voices that we heard in support of my filibuster that night are not the ones that we normally hear amplified across the state of Texas. And I think a lot of people who live outside our state are surprised that they even exist. But Texans know that the voices in our state that shout the loudest haven't often been the ones that speak for everyone. That night, the nation was introduced to a force within our state, a force that's going to have a lot to say about the shape that the future of Texas takes, the shape that America takes. As the second biggest state and the country's second largest economy, we have an outsized influence on the direction of the nation. And many Americans already see Texas as the gateway to a better life. We're the nation's #1 destination for internal migration. The reason, as any Texan will tell you, right, Bobby, is that we have a lot to be proud of. There's our very diverse and fast-growing economy, our abundant natural and energy resources, our long coastline, our low unemployment, and our low cost of living. And just as importantly, there is our fervent belief that a better tomorrow for ourselves and our children is just within our reach. My whole life, I have seen Texans create those tomorrows for themselves and their families. I've seen them raise themselves up by their bootstraps and by their slingbacks, and in my case, by pink running shoes. Texans work hard, and we believe that hard work should pay off. And the majority of Texans know that our state is stronger when it makes the investments in its people that help them reach their full potential. And yes, Texans know that there are areas where we can and we must do better. 1 out of every 10 public school students in the United States goes to school in Texas. And yet we produce the lowest percentage of high school graduates in the entire country. 1/4 of our children, 1/4, live in poverty. And though we like to brag about our economy in the state of Texas, we have the highest number of children living without insurance. That's obviously nothing to brag about. But like I said, we do have a lot to be proud of. And we're joined today by a few of those Texas leaders who not only know we can do better, but are helping to make Texas better. We have some of them in our audience today. We have our County Commissioner, Roy Brooks. I'm thrilled to be joined by one of our faith community leaders and also a school board trustee, Pastor Michael Evans. my incredible, beautiful sister in the Texas Senate, Leticia Vandepute, who was the one who asked finally at about 10:30 that night, at what point would it take for a woman's voice to be heard in the Texas Senate? Former Congressman Martin Frost, City Councilman Joel Burns, who represents a city council, my old city council district in Fort Worth, Justice of the Peace Sergio De Leon. And at the head table, we have some amazing people with us today, and you've been introduced a little bit to them. Bobby Patton is a local business leader, and he truly defines what it means to be a Texas success story and a true pioneering entrepreneur. Harris County Sheriff Adrian Garcia, and my very, very dear friend and Senate colleague, Rodney Ellis. You may remember that during the afternoon of the filibuster, Senator Ellis helped me with a back brace on the Senate floor. And I think it's very fair to say that from this point forward, Texas women know that Senator Ellis has our back. These leaders, these amazing leaders, are part of the growing movement to build a state that is more star and less lone. And while they're proud to talk about how great Texas is, they're also ready to talk about how it can be even greater. The majority of Texans are ready to start that conversation, but their voices are too often drowned out by the shouts of people in power who provoke division, who hope that shouting will distract from real solutions. They're doing serious damage to the lives and opportunities of the Texans that they claim to represent. They brag about our low unemployment while at the same time slashing and dramatically underfunding public education. They travel to states as far away as California and New York, trying to lure business to Texas while at the same time ignoring the needs in our community college and our higher education system to make sure that opportunities are available to all of our young Texans. And soon, we know the consequence of that will be that ultimately we'll probably have to travel to other states to import brain power too. They're not being true to what people in Texas are actually saying, people that they claim to represent. It would be just as if I pretended to be listening to what my grandfather had to say and writing down whatever I felt. You all know the saying, and some of you may know the Vern Gosdin song, "This Ain't My First Rodeo." And as Allison said, this was not my first filibuster. In 2011, I took a stand against a partisan plan to strip $5.4 billion from our already very underfunded public school system. And I don't know if you are aware of this, but after that budget cut went into place, Texas became 49th out of 51, counting DC, in what it's investing in the future of the school children in this country. I wanted to filibuster because it helped put us into a special session where teachers and parents finally had an opportunity to come to the Capitol and be heard. And it was very, very important to me that their voices be part of our conversation. And here's why. Because I've seen firsthand that education is absolutely a pathway from poverty. 30 years ago, I could not have imagined standing in front of you, standing in Washington, D.C., before a group of people like you. Because back then, my life looked so very, very different. In fact, it looked a lot like my mom's life. My mom has a 6th grade education, and after my parents divorced, she had no husband, no financial security, and 4 children to raise. And every meal that my mother put on our table was a struggle for her. By the time I was 19, I also was already married and divorced and raising a young daughter myself, living in poverty and facing the same challenges and hardships that I'd seen my mother face. Anyone who believes that everything is bigger in Texas did not see the trailer that my young daughter and I lived in. I was always on the brink of a financial disaster back then. A flat tire on my car meant having to choose a belonging to pawn at my local pawn shop. Often at the grocery store, I would stand at the checkout counter and I would have to choose what I was going to put back. Of course, the baby food for my daughter Amber was non-negotiable. So often for me, it was 99-cent Totino's pizzas, which I would cut into quarters and make last for 4 meals. Experiences like that can absolutely narrow your vision, can crush your optimism. For me, it came down to a simple calculation. If I really wanted to make a better life for Amber, I had a responsibility to improve my own. So it was with a heart full of love for her that I started that journey. At the time, I was working as a receptionist for a pediatrician, and even though my paycheck was small, it was worth it to work there. I had no health insurance, but my daughter had free medical care, and she had medicine, and she had free formula. One day at work, one of the nurses came in and dropped a pamphlet on my desk for Tarrant County Community College. And when I opened that pamphlet, it opened a door for me. I had always thought of college as something that belonged to someone else. But that day, I began to believe perhaps it could belong to me too. And the state of Texas helped by making it affordable, even for a single working mom like me. In addition to going to school, I still worked full-time, and I waited tables 4 nights a week. And while it wasn't easy, in the Texas that I grew up in, it was possible. When I transferred to Texas Christian University, I received academic and financial needs scholarships that covered the cost of my tuition. But today, students who are facing the same challenges that I once faced are unfortunately not able to receive that same kind of assistance from our state. There is so much greater need, so many qualified students in need who simply can't get that help because there's not enough to go around. There were other things that made my future possible too. When I needed basic health care services, I had a women's health care clinic very close to where I lived. And for those next few years, that's where I received the entirety of my health care. Today, of course, in Texas, partisan legislation on top of years of severe budget cuts has cut that access from tens of thousands of women across the state. And each of them has lost the only health care that they ever know. Regardless of your politics, I think everyone would agree that is just bad policy. Because I was able to go to college and law school, I was able to be a part of starting a couple of small businesses and to become part of contributing back to the economy of my state. And that's how it works. And I want so very much to make sure that more people have the chance to do that. And so the challenges that I've taken on as a legislator are really about 2 things: a path and a voice. And though I've been characterized by our governor and some others in the legislature as a bit of a problem, my record is really about trying to find solutions. I started my politics on the Fort Worth City Council, and in Texas, we do not run for local office with a party affiliation next to our name. And as a consequence, we don't govern with one either. And I got in the habit of working on issues that aren't considered naturals for Democrats, from shale gas drilling to transportation planning to serving as the chair of our city's Economic Development Committee and fostering a great deal of economic development through private-public partnerships. And I was determined that I was going to take that mentality to Austin. In fact, it's one of the reasons that I ran for the state Senate. The district I represent actually wasn't drawn for a Democrat, but the people I represent are a lot more interested in seeing problems solved than they are in partisan labels. They know how seriously I take bringing their voice to Austin and how willing I am to work with anyone to get things done. One thing you should know about the Texas Capitol is we don't have to cross an aisle to work across party lines because there really is no aisle. Instead, when we want to work and when I want to work with one of my Republican colleagues, I simply scoop my chair across the Senate floor and we begin. For example, in the last legislative session, I worked with a bipartisan coalition of lawmakers to pass equal pay for equal work legislation. But even though there were Republican lawmakers who were willing to work with me to see this injustice made right, Governor Perry, in what was an overtly partisan move, vetoed that bill. That not only undercuts the potential of Texas women, it also makes Texas a less attractive place to do business. And Texas families are paying the price. Having been there, I understand how precious those few dollars can be, how very much of a difference they can make. And that's why another one of my very real passions has been consumer reform. If you've ever had to go to a pawn shop or a payday lender in Texas, and I have, you know that Texas is the wild, wild west when it comes to the predatory lending industry. The state turns its head as this industry siphons precious dollars from local economies and traps hard-working families into a cycle of debt that they cannot escape. I've worked closely with an unlikely coalition of folks to try to address this issue, from the Christian Life Commission to the AARP to the Defense Department, because of the fact that so many military members are subjected to those practices. I've also worked to ensure that state agencies operate with oversight, transparency, and a commitment to being effective stewards of taxpayer dollars. In Texas, some of our elected officials have turned those state agencies into cash cows and favor factories to further their own interests and to reward their donors. And for all the rhetoric, and I know we all hear it, about big government and small government, Texans want what I think everyone wants. They just want to see good government. I've continued to take on issues that people don't always associate with Democrats. These problems don't have a party affiliation, and their solutions shouldn't either. I've championed the needs of returning veterans like Richard. After returning from Iraq, Richard, like many suffering from the stress of war, found himself in the criminal justice system. And Senator Van de Putte and I helped to create veterans courts to recognize veterans' service and their unique needs and to prioritize treatment and counseling for them. We wanted these veterans back on their feet and back in our job force. Yes. And I've also been a strong advocate for transportation and water infrastructure to grow our economy. When the natural gas industry needed a way to transport gas and waste fluids from fracking sites, I helped transport that valuable gas and the wastewater through pipelines in our state's right-of-way. And I've fought to help rape victims like Christy make sure that the state is getting sexual predators off the street by testing every rape kit on an evidence room shelf. It's, of course, a very important way to make our communities safer and to provide victims and their families the comfort of knowing that their attackers will be prosecuted. Those are just a few examples of how important it is to find common ground. So I want to leave you with this. I will seek common ground because we all must. But sometimes you have to take a stand on sacred ground. liberty, the freedom to choose what your future will hold. In the past few weeks, I've had so many young women tell me how much it meant to them to see me stand up for them and to be standing alongside them. And after the filibuster, I've had more than a few come to me and simply cry. And what I see in their tears are not tears of defeat. Instead, it's their understanding that even if only for a short while, their voices as much as mine made a difference in the landscape of what was happening in the state of Texas. They were feeling the empowerment of discovery, the moment of realization that they had a voice. It's a powerful feeling. I know because I remember the first moment that I discovered my own. You may think that that moment came when I walked across the stage at Harvard Law School to accept my diploma. Or you may think it came when I raised my hand for the first time to be sworn into public office. But actually, it happened when I was standing in front of a bookshelf at Tarrant County Community College, holding what was to be my very first college book. I will never forget the feeling of that book in my hands. It was an incredible and overpowering moment. It was farther than anyone in my family had ever gotten, and it was farther than I had ever hoped for myself. I know how proud my mother was because I know how proud I was of my girls on their first day of college. Every Texan deserves that moment. Every Texan deserves a voice. And every Texan needs to know that the future belongs to all of us, and we all can play a role in shaping it. The leaders who capture this spirit will be the ones who write the next chapter in Texas' story, in America's story. As I learned sitting at the kitchen table with my grandfather, the task may not be quick, and it may not be easy, but it's important, it's essential, and together, it can be done. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions, and many of them, as you might imagine, are along the same themes. So let's just get this out of the way right away. You mentioned your feud with Rick Perry. Are you thinking about running to succeed him as governor?
Well, a lot of people are asking me that question lately, as you can imagine, and I'm working very hard to decide what my next steps will be. I do think that in Texas, people feel like we need a change from the very fractured, very partisan leadership that we're seeing in our state government right now.
What about a bid for another statewide office other than governor? This questioner says perhaps U.S. senator or lieutenant governor, easily the most powerful office in Texas.
Well, I can say with absolute certainty that I will run for one of two offices, either my state Senate seat or the governor.
One more question along these lines. This person asks, would you consider running as a VP candidate with Hillary Clinton?
Well, in answer to that, I would say we will have to find out whether Hillary's planning to run for president first.
You obviously are having a big moment in the spotlight. We're happy to have you here today. Beyond your own potential electoral future, what can you parlay this into next?
I do think that the most extraordinary outcome from the day of the filibuster was what I talked about in my speech. An opportunity really to be a voice for people and to continue a conversation going about the things that need to be addressed in Texas. And it isn't just about reproductive rights, though that day was about reproductive rights. It's about the vacuum of leadership that's happening there. It's about the failure of our state leaders who are currently in power to really be connected to what Texas families want to see, whether it's the dramatic number of folks in Texas who don't have health insurance, whether it's the dramatic defunding of public education that has put us into a battle in the court system in Texas for the last year and a half or so, whether it's a failure to invest in higher education. Texas really isn't listening to families, and I think we see it. When you look at the voter turnout in the state of Texas, it's abysmally low. And I think it can be attributed to the fact that so many people feel disconnected. They feel like it doesn't matter, and that even if they participate in that democratic process, it won't make a difference. And if any outcome for me comes from the moment in the spotlight that the filibuster provided, it would be to make sure that I play a part in changing that in Texas.
Looking at the filibuster, the questioner asks, which legislative rules did you consider when planning the filibuster? Those that helped you do that for so many hours and those that might have hurt?
Well, the rules in the Texas Senate for a filibuster are very different than they are here in D.C. in the U.S. Senate. A filibuster is a filibuster in the Texas Senate. It's a test of physical and mental endurance. The person conducting the filibuster, I'm touching the podium right now. I could not touch my desk. No water, no bathroom breaks, no food. And you must talk continuously, and you must talk on topic, at least relatively so. That had been the tradition in the Texas Senate, and it's been respected, very respected as a tradition of that body because it is such a test of physical and mental endurance. But the filibuster that I conducted, I think Senator Ellis and Senator Van de Putte would agree, they've been there a lot longer than I have. It was subjected to an extraordinary scrutiny that had never occurred before. In fact, the day before I started the filibuster, Senator Barrientos, who was quite well known for filibustering bills in the Texas Senate, came in to give me some advice. He said, it's not that bad. You can lean on your desk. You know, you can have a few hard candies in your pocket. People on occasion have been known to give their colleagues ice chips on the Senate floor. It'll be fine. And you can read just, anything you want because you're not going to get challenged on that. Read the phone book, read a book. Well, it didn't take very long to figure out that that wasn't exactly the response I was going to receive from many of my colleagues in the Senate that day. And not only were we held to a very extraordinary level of adherence to the Senate rules in terms of what they say, but I think many would agree that the rules were completely broken in order to bring an end to the filibuster that night. And what we saw with that were two things. Number one, when I was halted while debate occurred on the filibuster for the next hour and a half, we saw my Democratic Senate colleagues using the rules so masterfully to argue parliamentary procedure. And believe me, we were watching that clock ticking, ticking, ticking every moment. And ultimately, when even they couldn't succeed after taking that football and running down the field with it, the people who had sat in the gallery all day long, so respectful. You literally could hear a pin drop in the Senate chamber that day, though the gallery was completely filled. They finally had had enough of not seeing adherence and respect for the Senate rules by the presiding officer and by many others in the chamber. And I think they ultimately couldn't respect those rules anymore themselves. Leticia's comment, of course, set them off. It was a beautiful comment. It was a beautiful and powerful moment in democracy because it was such a force of voice and such a wonder to see that at least for that point in time, they were able to stop a bad piece of legislation from passing.
Now, the legislation was described in shorthand as banning abortion after 20 weeks. Can you describe, given that we're a national audience today and many Texas politicians and reporters, but not all of us, describe what else was included and what you saw as the most damaging provisions in that measure?
Sure. Republicans, of course, would like everyone to believe that that's what that bill was about. But in Texas, 0.57% of those procedures occur after 20 weeks, and the dramatic number of those in situations where a very well-loved, very much wanted baby has been found to have very severe problems. Instead, what the bill was really about, and it's been disappointing that this hasn't been enough of the conversation, it was really about closing women's access to a very important healthcare service in the state of Texas, because these clinics in many instances are dual purpose. By the rules, there were three other pieces. One was that ambulatory surgical center standards would have to be adhered to, though the sponsor of the bill couldn't point to a single reason about those rules that would actually make clinics any safer, and in fact couldn't point to any problems that existed in Texas clinics. We are highly regulated there. And in fact, by moving them to that standard, now rather than being inspected once a year, which they're currently required to do, they'll only be inspected every 3 to 6 years. And a lot of us had a hard time understanding how that was going to make the climate safer for women. There was also, equally as damaging, a provision that doctors must be licensed to practice, have admitting privileges at a hospital within a short distance of these clinics. And again, no real reason could be provided why that was important, but what it will do, and I think clearly those who advocated for it understand it will do, is severely constrain the practitioners in the arena and thereby constrain, of course, the service. And then finally, there was a provision changing the way the RU-486 drug could be administered. It's a drug that's used in the very early stages of a pregnancy. And right now, under the law, a doctor administers it to a patient. There are 2 doses that are taken, but they're taken at home in the privacy of the patient's home. And many patients select to do that. Many women select to do that. In Texas now, that first dose must be given at an ambulatory surgical center. No one can describe why that needs to happen. And the second dose must also occur at the ambulatory surgical center. And then the woman must come back 2 weeks later for a follow-up visit. And prior to that, of course, because of the law that passed last session, she also has to have had a sonogram. So that's 4 visits a woman must now make. And for women who are traveling great distances, and many have to in a state as large as Texas, and particularly now that so many clinics will close, it's estimated that 37 of the 42 clinics will close. Women literally are going to lose their access to care. And what was most distressing about it was that the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists argued vociferously against that bill and urged us to understand that this was going to have a very dramatic and negative impact on women's health in Texas, and yet they were ignored. So there was a lot more to that bill, obviously, than they'd like you to think there was.
Could you discuss what legal limits on abortion you do support?
You know, the Supreme Court has made that decision. And it's one of the protected liberties under our Constitution. And I respect the constitutional protections that are in place today, whether it be for this purpose or whether it be for other protected purposes in the Constitution. I don't think we can pick and choose.
questioner asks, for little girls and little boys who are considering that they someday may wish to serve as an elected official, what advice do you have for them?
The thing that I find most wonderful about serving has been that two pieces of my life have come together in a way that I feel is perfect for me. One is my journey to get here, and the heart and the understanding that I have for people, but also the incredibly excellent education that I was able to receive. Those two things combined, I think, have really served me well in my public service capacity. So for anyone wishing to pursue a public service career, I would ask them first to listen to their heart, see what it is truly that they're passionate about and that motivates them, and get a good education. And hopefully one day in Texas we'll be providing more and more of those for young people to be able to find their way along that path.
Back to Texas politics. What is your reaction to the fact that Governor Perry is considering a 2016 repeat of a presidential bid?
Well, I have three responses to that. I think that's all I'm going to say about that.
Would you like to give us those responses? Whether or not you run, which statewide office do you think Democrats have the best chance of winning in Texas?
You know, I think the question really is, what chance do new leaders have of winning elected office in the state of Texas? I think the best place to start that conversation is to talk about what Texans want to see in their government, and not to talk about it in party frames. I represent a Senate district that many consider to be a Republican one. It's certainly a swing district at least. And the people that I represent have never wanted to have conversations about party. They want to have conversations about problems and what my proposed solutions for those problems are. So the best chance that we have of bringing new leadership in Texas, I think, will look a lot like that.
This questioner asks, what is keeping Texas from shading more purple politically? Given the growth in the Latino population and the growth of urban centers in Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, why is it so hard for Democrats to win statewide office?
Well, first of all, people have to run. And second of all, I think back to a point I made earlier, we have a very, very low voter participation in Texas. And we certainly know that our current Attorney General has done everything he can, actually, to depress that as much as possible. I think there's an opportunity not to, again, be thinking about this in terms of red or purple or blue, but to be thinking about it in terms of speaking to the true values that Texas families hold, and hopefully encouraging and inspiring them in a way that they feel engaged to participate again.
A couple questions about when you think Democrats might achieve parity in Texas with Republicans, and then one questioner follows up saying, do you think Republican actions like the voter ID law will delay that?
Parity obviously will be at the choice of voters. I think that the principles that Democrats stand for in Texas today align more closely with Texas families. I think what we see in Texas, we've seen all over the country, where districts have been drawn through redistricting processes that have taken place over the last couple of decades that have meant conversations now only take place at the extreme party level. So in Texas, where the dramatic number of our districts are Republican, the only conversations that are really being had in the political arena, which of course is the best place for public discourse on issues, are taking place at the very far right extreme. It's not reflective of who people in Texas really are. And I think parity will come, once again, not to keep repeating the same answer, but to be able to engage with people at their values and hopefully to get them to think about things in a new way.
How does the Democratic Party become attractive to Texas Hispanics while advocating strong pro-choice policies?
The Latino community in Texas, I think, is no different than the Anglo or the African American community. They want leaders who are going to care about and work on the things that matter to their families. When you poll Texans, for example, everyone wants to see us prioritize education. Everyone wants to see us prioritize economic development. Everyone wants to see us prioritize making healthcare available to all. And those values, I think, translate across ethnic lines and can certainly and absolutely most certainly today are being far better represented by the Democrats in Texas than they are elsewhere.
Now, you mentioned before that we don't know yet whether Hillary Clinton will run, but if she does run, do you think she stands a chance of carrying Texas in 2016, and would you like her to run?
You know, I think that Hillary Clinton has a chance to do just about anything she sets her mind to. So, of course, I would admire her effort in that regard and be tremendously respectful of that.
There's a lot of buzz in Washington about the Castro brothers from Texas. Which one of them do you think has the best chance of winning statewide office?
They are such extraordinary people, Julian and Joaquin, and we're so lucky to have young, emerging leaders like them in Texas. I think the sky's the limit for them. I think they both have incredible opportunity available to them, and the moment they decide to set their foot on that path to make it happen, they're going to see it happen.
Would you like to see Cecile Richards return to Texas and run for statewide office?
Cecile is such an extraordinary human being. We've gotten to spend a lot of time together, as you can imagine, over the last few weeks because of the issues that we've been talking about in Texas. And of course, she is confronting this battle as the executive director of Planned Parenthood all over the country. But she has a special place in her heart for Texas because of her mother's history there, Ann Richards, and Cecile and her husband worked so incredibly hard to help Ann get elected. They are true believers when it comes to grassroots conversations and organizing. They're true believers in the fact that we can have leaders that will reflect real people in real communities all over the state of Texas. Cecile, like the Castro brothers, I think she sets her mind to something, she's going to do it. So I would welcome her back to Texas. I'll sign up for her campaign if she wants to run.
You mentioned redistricting in Texas as well as in other states. In Texas, do you believe that the court-ordered interim congressional redistricting lines, ratified, of course, by the legislature in the first special session, violate the Voting Rights Act in the wake of the Shelby County ruling, and if so, why?
I absolutely do believe that they violate the Voting Rights Act. And the reason, I'm not sure if you're aware of the distinction that Texas holds right now. It's not one, again, for us to be bragging about. But the distinction that we hold is we are the only state that recently went through redistricting and a court challenge where intentional discrimination was found. And intentional discrimination was found in the drawing of our Senate maps, and I believe in the drawing of our congressional maps. So I think because of that intentional discrimination, they will continue to be subject to a Voting Rights Act challenge in spite of the threat to Section 5 that Shelby County proposed. The Voting Rights Act is still alive. The only piece of it that may go away with that decision is the injunctive relief that it provided. But I think at the end of the day, the court will be consistent with its earlier rulings and will find a Voting Rights Act challenge to be one that is valid.
Questioner says, there's been a lot of talk in the last year about a, quote, war on women. Do you think it is a real phenomenon?
Well, you know, we had a couple of examples this session of why people are feeling that way. One, of course, was this issue of reproductive rights, but it's following on a history of a number of things happening in Texas. In the prior legislative session, there were two distinct challenges that were brought on women's health care in Texas. One was a challenge to the women's health program where we were getting 90 cents of every dollar from our federal tax dollars returned to Texas to support women's health. And Texas legislative leaders who are in power today closed the door to that. We turned that money away. It was about $36 million a year, and it's now costing us dramatically more in the increase in Medicaid births that occurred as a consequence of that. There also was a dramatic cut to the state-supported funding for women's health care in Texas. And keep in mind, these are family planning clinics, women's health clinics that do nothing but that. We're not talking about reproductive rights here. These are clinics that are providing birth control, family planning. They're providing mammograms. They're providing other cancer screenings and blood pressure and diabetes screenings. And again, for many women, as was the case for me, the only place where women are receiving their health care in Texas. And about 2/3 of the funding for that was removed in that 2011 budget. And literally, within months, clinics all over the state of Texas started closing. We, I think at last count, had 56 clinics that have closed. And there's been no return of that service for women since that time. In spite of the fact that we added money to the budget in this last legislative session to try to accommodate that, the safety net is so badly fractured that putting it back together is going to take many years. And in the meantime, many women are going without having their health care needs addressed. And then, of course, in this last legislative session, the equal pay for equal work bill. It was a lot of work, wasn't it, Senator, trying to get that bill out of the Senate and out of the House. But we did it. We formed a bipartisan coalition, and we made it happen. And after all of that work, for the governor to veto the bill and to demonstrate that he didn't think that that was an important issue, that he didn't understand how very valuable that is, not just to women who are single head of households, but women who are part of a two-party working relationship for a family, how badly it hurts them. He showed that he's completely disconnected from the reality of what's happening to women in the state of Texas today.
We are almost out of time, but before asking the last question, I've got a couple of housekeeping matters to take care of. First of all, I'd like to remind you about our upcoming luncheon speakers. On September 10th, we have Dr. Tarmas R. Frieden, Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. On September 17th, we have Mary Fallon, Governor of Oklahoma and Vice Chairwoman of the National Governors Association. And on November 11th, we have Walt Bettinger, President and CEO of the Charles Schwab Corporation. Second, I would like to present our guest with the traditional National Press Club coffee mug, which we expect to see on TV, on the desk, if there's another filibuster.
Oh, thank you so much,
Thank you.
Allison. Thank you.
And for the final question, most of you in the audience can't see the shoes that are on today, but I can tell you they are not pink sneakers. They are cream-colored, open-toed slingbacks. But we want to know, what is going to become of the pink sneakers?
Well, to the horror of a couple of people on my political team, I immediately put them back on and started running on the trail again with them. At some point, before they completely fall apart, I'll set them aside because they'll be a memory that I will treasure forever.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming today. I'd also like to thank the National Press Club staff, including our Journalism Institute and Broadcast Center, for helping organize today's event. Finally, here's a reminder, you can find more information about the National Press Club on our website, and if you'd like a copy of today's program, you can find it there as well at www.press.org. Thank you. We are adjourned. Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Angela Greiling-Keene. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News and the 106th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming with events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. To donate to programs offered to the public through our National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit press.org/institute. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you in our audience today. Our head table includes guests of our speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. And if you hear applause in our audience, I'd note that members of the general public are also attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are featured on our member-produced podcasts available on iTunes. You can follow the action on Twitter today using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a question and answer period. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you to stand briefly as your name is announced. From your right, Carl Lubsdorf, Dallas Morning News, Washington columnist. Maria Recio, Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Washington bureau chief with McClatchy Newspapers. David Calloway, USA Today, editor-in-chief.
Paralysis. When my mom and my siblings and I would pile into my mom's old hatchback Volkswagen and drive to Muleshoe to visit him, we would pick him up at the nursing home and keep him in his home for the weekend with us. At some point on several of those occasions, my grandfather would beckon me into the kitchen, and I would sit with him at their old Formica table, you know, the ones that have the silver band that goes around the side. And he would bring a piece of paper out, point very determinedly at it, and I knew my task. He would dictate to me a letter that he hoped to communicate to a friend. And as you can imagine, he's sitting there in his wheelchair, me with my tiny legs stuck to the plastic chairs in their kitchen on a hot summer day. It was a lot of hard work. It was slow, and it could be very, very difficult. And it was challenging, not just for him, but challenging for me as well. And invariably, on those occasions, my grandfather would start crying, which meant that I would start crying too. It's a very hard lesson for a 9-year-old to witness the despair in her grandfather's face. But the experience drove home a very powerful lesson for me: the importance of having a voice, how painful it is to lose it, and how important it is to speak up for those who can't speak.
To help support her single mother and 3 siblings. By 19, Senator Davis was a single mother herself, working 2 jobs to make ends meet in hopes of creating a better life for her young daughter. She eventually enrolled in community college, a journey that culminated with a law degree from Harvard. Soon after, Senator Davis became a practicing attorney in Fort Worth and served 9 years on the Fort Worth City Council. She was recruited to run for the Texas Senate and scored a huge political upset by defeating a well-entrenched incumbent. In the Senate, Senator Davis ran and won election to the She won election in 2008 in a race that was considered one of the biggest upsets in Texas politics in recent times. She was reelected in 2012, despite Governor Rick Perry and every major statewide Republican office holder personally campaigning against her. In the Senate, her main issues are economic development, education, and family issues. She was named Freshman Legislator of the Year in 2009 and was cited by Texas Monthly Magazine as one of the state's 10 best legislators. She apparently likes the filibuster because, prior to the one that got her national attention, in 2011, she staged a filibuster on public education that drew statewide attention to a multi-billion-dollar cut in Texas public schools. That filibuster temporarily blocked the cuts and set the stage for the legislature restoring most of the money in 2013. Senator Davis has been mentioned as a possible gubernatorial candidate in Texas. a steep climb for a Democrat in such a red state. We're hoping she might tip her cards here today on what her future might hold. Please help me give a warm National Press Club welcome to Senator Wendy Davis.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me here today, and thank you, Angela, for inviting me to be here. It really is a pleasure to be in such an esteemed group of people. Now, I have to tell you that people get a little bit nervous when I approach a podium these days. And I'm sure that you obviously know what happened on June 25th in the Texas legislature, but in case you were one of the few people who was not live streaming it, I thought I would just repeat the entire thing for you today. So y'all need to just get comfortable. In seriousness, I am very honored, and I'm so grateful that you're interested in hearing more from me. I'm constantly reminded what a privilege it is to have a voice in a decision that affects everyone's lives and their future. And though I mean voice figuratively, my initial understanding of the power of voice was actually quite literal. When I was a young girl, my family tried to spend as much time as we could with my grandparents. They lived in the panhandle of Texas in a small city called Muleshoe. My grandfather made his living his entire life as a tenant farmer. And when he was in his mid-60s, Neely Stovall suffered a massive stroke. From that point forward, he lived the rest of his life in a nursing home. He was partially paralyzed, and he had a very, very difficult time forming words because of his paralysis.
Adrian Garcia, Harris County Sheriff. Kevin Merida, Washington Post Managing Editor. The Honorable Rodney Ellis, Texas State Senator. Skipping over the podium, Allison Fitzgerald, Project Manager for Financial and State News with the Center for Public Integrity and the Chair of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Skipping over the speaker for a moment, Bob Cardin with Cardin Communications and the Speakers Committee member who organized today's lunch. Thank you, Bob. Bobby Patton, a Fort Worth business leader and the owner of the LA Dodgers. Betsy Fisher Martin, the Senior Executive Producer and Manager of Political Programming for NBC News. Marilyn Thompson, Bureau Chief for Thomson Reuters. Jamila Bey, a host and reporter with Voice of Russia and a blogger for the Washington Post She the People blog. And Rick Dunham, a political reporter with the Houston Chronicle and a former National Press Club president. It seems now like the whole country was watching when our guest today literally stood up for her beliefs on the floor of the Texas State House. For 12 hours, she filibustered a Republican-sponsored abortion bill on her feet without being able to sit, lean on her desk, or drink water. That act temporarily blocked the abortion bill and made Texas State Senator Wendy Davis a hero to liberals and pro-choice activists. Senator Davis is no stranger at beating the odds. She began working after school when she was 14